In this video, I'm briefly going to discuss Descartes' theory of knowledge, which he discusses in his little book, The Meditations. So Descartes' theory of knowledge is in many ways similar to Plato's theory of the forms. So Descartes, just like Plato, held to what is known as mind-body dualism. Both of these philosophers divide human beings into bodies and minds, and privilege the mind or the soul at the expense of the body. Rather than uniting these things, seeing them as a single unity, they separate them. In philosophy, this generally is known as idealism, because what idealism does is it sees that it privileges thinking, it privileges the mind over the body. It also privileges contemplation over action. There have been many critics of this who have said that these philosophers have mistakenly separated mind and body. But to see what they're doing, I want to talk a little bit now about Descartes' mind-body dualism. So the primary philosophical question that Descartes was asking was the following one: is there anything that I can know with absolute certainty? Because Descartes was not okay with knowledge that was questionable or doubtable. He wanted what he called indubitable, absolute knowledge that he could know with absolute certainty. So in his text, The Meditations, he begins with the observation that there are many things that throughout his life he's come to believe that have turned out to be false. And that even many of his most foundational beliefs, on closer inspection and investigation, turned out to be false. This is something that probably many people go through at some point in their life. Anytime you reach adulthood, you probably start to question many of the things you grew up believing. Some of them you may retain, and others you may start to question altogether. This is a very natural type of thing. But I don't think necessarily many people will then draw the conclusion, I want to know something that is absolutely certain. This was Descartes' quest, and he says in The Meditation that he wants to ground philosophy in a set of principles that are absolutely certain and indubitable. And he asks the question, well, is this possible? And what he does in that text is he looks at judgments and truths that he has arrived at by using his five senses. So touch, sight, hearing, smell, and taste. And Descartes asks himself the question, are these sense activities capable of providing me with certain knowledge, with knowledge that is certain and indubitable? Let's look at what he says. So he says, well, it's often been the case that I've seen things, right? There's things that I've seen that I thought to be true, but on closer inspection turned out to be false, right? Maybe you're walking through town and you see a friend that you haven't seen for a long time, or someone that's close to you, and you see them far away, or a family member, and you walk up and you greet them, and it turns out it was someone totally different. And this is probably something that happens to many people. We see something that appears to be the case, and on closer inspection, it turns out to be something very different. Now, some philosophers, such as Sigmund Freud, who was, I would say, a philosopher, not a psychologist, because many of his views have been proved to be unscientific, but nonetheless, philosophically, they're interesting at times, would claim that when you thought you saw your friend or your family member, you had a kind of unconscious desire to see that person, and that it was a kind of wish fulfillment. So you did see something, and what you saw was a manifestation of your unconscious. But nonetheless, in Descartes' analysis, what Descartes would say is, well, you made a mistake. You thought you saw something, and it turned out to be false. So what Descartes then says is that since there are such cases where my vision provides me with a error, I can't rely ever on my vision to provide me with true knowledge. That's his operation. If I can make a mistake, if I can make an error, then I can't rely on it to make true judgments. Okay, let's think about hearing. Well, probably many of you are familiar with gossip. You've probably heard something from a friend about someone, or you heard something on the news that on closer inspection turned out to be false. This is a very common thing. It's the little game of telephone that you play when you're a child. Some rumor is spread, and by the time it gets to the fifth or sixth person, it's something entirely different. Again, because my hearing can provide me with mistaken judgments, it indeed turns out that I can't rely on my hearing. Because what Descartes says, his approach is, if it can provide me with any case of error, then I can't ever rely on it to provide me with certain knowledge. Okay, let's think about taste. Well, there are probably cases where we think we taste the true property of a thing, but on closer inspection it turns out that it didn't actually taste that way at all. To give you a contemporary example, it may be that you're trying to taste your favorite dessert, but you turn out you say to someone who made your favorite dessert, it doesn't taste like anything at all. It's tasteless. Well, and then your friend says, perhaps you have coronavirus. Maybe you need to go get a test. And indeed, it turns out you have coronavirus. But the point is, that was a very common symptom of not having taste, not being able to taste. The point here is that you thought that the dessert was tasteless, and maybe you got angry with your friend that they made a tasteless dessert. But what actually turned out is you had this virus that deceived you. Again, the very fact that can happen, Descartes would say you can't rely on your taste sensation to give you the true access to knowledge. Okay, what other ones do we have? So seeing, tasting. Let's smell. Well, maybe you can't smell anything. And maybe actually there's a very bad smell, or maybe there's some kind of bad smell in the room, and everyone can smell it, but you don't smell anything. Okay, again, maybe you're ill, maybe you have a cold or something. The very fact that this can happen, Descartes says, no, you can't rely on your smell to provide you with true knowledge. The last one is touch. Maybe you touch something and it feels very, very warm to you. But actually, maybe you have, you're hallucinating, or maybe you have some kind of disorder that makes it where you touch things and they feel warm, but actually they're cold. Again, the point is simply that you've been deceived. So what Descartes then concludes from this is that because your senses can provide you with error, you can't rely on them to arrive at true knowledge that is absolutely certain. And therefore, your senses do not provide you with true knowledge. So Descartes then asks, but is there anything that I can know with absolute certainty? And he says, well, one of the things that I can know for sure is that I'm being deceived, right? That I'm the one being deceived. Even if everything I were seeing, feeling, hearing, smelling, tasting, even if all those things were deceiving me, I would nonetheless be the one that's being deceived. And therefore, what Descartes says is, no matter how deceived I'm being, I can know with absolute certainty that I'm the one that's being deceived. And therefore, the fact that I'm thinking that I'm deceived, the fact that I'm perceiving that I'm deceived, is something that I can know with certainty. even if the whole world were an illusion, if I were dreaming, I can nonetheless know that I'm the one that's perceiving all these things and being deceived about all of this. And therefore, what Descartes concludes for that is that the fact that I'm thinking is absolutely certain to me. And the only thing that I can really know that exists, therefore, is that I'm thinking. But the fact that I'm thinking proves that there's something about me that exists. And hence he famously concludes, I think, therefore I am. In Latin, cogito ergo sum. I think, the very fact that I'm thinking is absolutely certain, and therefore I exist. The fact that I'm thinking is certain. And Descartes' philosophical operation is to therefore privilege the activities of thinking, the activities of the soul, over the activities of sensation, which can provide me with deception. Which again is very similar to Plato. Plato thinks that it's somewhat different, because Plato thinks that our sensation only provides us with particular representations of things, whereas our soul provides us with universal truths. In the case of Descartes, our body, our sensations, provide us with error, and therefore we can't rely on them, whereas the activity of the soul, which he thinks is absolutely certain, provides us with access to universal truths that are indubitable. And it's in this way that Descartes thinks that philosophy begins with the soul, begins with the activities of reason, and he thought that everything that can be knowable is rational. Anything that is arrived at by the use of the senses is rational, is false, and doesn't provide us with truth. And Descartes thought that all philosophical truths will be rational, will be abstract. And in his case, Descartes was writing in the 17th century, in which science, as we know it today, modern science, was on the rise. And scientists were trying to understand the world scientifically using mathematical principles, using formulas, also using experimentation, but in order to arrive at universal quantifiable truths. And so Descartes, in many ways, is kind of trying to theorize this in a philosophical way. And in philosophy, what is known as the Cartesian approach is precisely this. It is to begin philosophy with reason, and to believe that philosophy begins with reason, that philosophy begins with rational activity at the expense of everything else. That is the Cartesian approach. And to view all knowledge arrived at through the senses as more or less being questionable, and to privilege purely abstract mathematical principles over everything else. So Descartes, was very much a believer in geometry. He pioneered one of the works of geometry, known as analytical geometry. This is still taught in basic geometry courses. And he was very much a believer in abstract mathematics. So that's Descartes' approach. And so to answer the question, what can we know? Descartes thought the only thing that we can know are things that we can know for certain, and things that we can know through reason. And Descartes' philosophy is an attempt to create a method that will allow us to have access to what he calls clear and distinct truths that are knowable through reason. Okay, so I'm going to end there. That is Descartes' philosophy.